Right. Yeah, well, it's good hearty good morning this morning. So, well, here we are. We're going to be we're actually moving into the last few verses of chapter 3 this morning in John chapter 3. Before we read this, verses 31 through 36, I'm going to read what's prior, what we've been looking at in verses 22 through 30, and this is the last testimony of John the Baptist, his last words. After these things came Jesus and his disciples into the land of Judea, and there he tarried with them and baptized. And John also, being in Aenon near Salim, because there was much water there, and they came and they were baptized. For John was not yet cast into prison. Then there arose a question between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purifying. And they came unto John and said unto him, Rabbi, he that was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you bearest witness, behold, the same baptize, and all men come to him. I'm reading out of King James, but I kind of change things as I go, so bear with me here. And the reason I use this Bible, it's my oldest Bible, but it also fits in the bag. So John answered and said, a man can receive nothing except to be given to him from heaven. Ye yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but that I am sent before him. He that hath the bridegroom he that has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This is my joy, therefore is fulfilled. He must increase and I must decrease. That, in my opinion, is the end of John's testimony. Last words of John the Baptist, right there, in my opinion. Some of your Bibles go on and state that John's words continue, but I believe there's a break there. And now the Apostle John, verses 31 through 36, is making his last conclusive remarks, which I believe close this entire section. So 31 through 36, in my mind, is a conclusion of what John has stated thus far in his gospel, and that's how we will be reading this section today. So would somebody read verses 31 through 36?
Be happy to. He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth is from the earth and speaks of the earth. He who comes from heaven is above all. What he has seen and heard of that, he testifies, and no one receives his testimony. He who has received his testimony has set his seal on this, that God is true. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him.
Okay, good. Thank you, David. Now, at first reading, again, John's final declaration, at first reading these verses, boy, they tend to be disjointed. So we're going to work through section by section and with as a group this morning. So first of all, before we do that, it would be extremely helpful for us to take a look at the readers themselves. Who were these people receiving this letter from John the Apostle? And what do we know about them? So first of all, the readers of John's gospel account are members of what we are calling, actually I kind of coined this term, called the jungle. And the jungle is our term, our way of stating, the jungle is represented by that gray backdrop there that we created earlier in this study. And this term is our way of stating the general human condition, which Jesus has now. Let me state the general human condition is that, the way I'm viewing this is that the incarnate Word is now speaking in through the person of Jesus and has entered this human condition. And the remainder of the gospel is going to see the incarnate Word, Jesus the Christ, interact within this context. And this context has a lot of correlation to today, because we, in my opinion, are still living in a jungle, and the jungle is characterized by three primary issues defining the human condition. That is comparison, resistance, and dominance. Those are three things that we have seen throughout all of history that are ingrained within us as human beings. This tendency to compare, this tendency to resist, and this tendency to dominate over who else. And we get that out of Genesis. We looked at Genesis chapter 4 following the story in Genesis chapter 3. So, anyway, Jesus is now entering this jungle context, and which represents the human condition, and his purpose, Jesus, the Christ, has now entered in order to bring radically new life and ultimately restore all things. Now again, this is out of my way I think that the ministry of Jesus Christ, he brought with him the kingdom of God and the purpose to restore all things back togetherness and to wholeness. That's the big 30,000 foot view. So these people are living at the end of the first century within the jungle. And then secondly, from the first three chapters, we know that these people were familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. It is clear by the references of John the Apostle to the Old Testament. I mean, how the gospel starts out in the beginning. If that is not a correlation to Genesis 1:1, I mean, he's bringing the audience right back to something they were really familiar with, the Torah, and identifying the opening, correlating the opening verses of Genesis. And they were also familiar with the ministry of John the Baptist. Now there's people that say out there, well, this gospel's target group were these people, Gentiles. These were Jews. Well, I think this is a Jewish-dominated audience, but also because at the end of the first century, there are churches forming. And though there are people everywhere trying to figure out, but John is depicting the recent history and the role of John the Baptist, who was a very powerful person in both pre ministry of Jesus. So these are important distinctives that John is communicating to an audience familiar with Old Testament and John the Baptist. We also know from history that the churches were being formed, but yet Christianity was not yet defined. I mean, where do we put this Jesus? I mean, that is a big question. They were experiencing degrees of persecution, both from Rome, thus the recent destruction of the temple out of revolt, and within the Jewish synagogue. Because now you're bringing in this Jesus, these people who were believing in Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, into an existing worship context, and they're trying to figure it out. So there was maybe light persecution, being ostracized within the synagogue, but there was also this overarching persecution that was occurring at various levels from Rome, to stamp this religious craziness out. And so there was a lot of pain here, both internal and external. It was a confusing time. John's role is a pastor. He's being a pastor here to draw in the people, to impart hope into this dark jungle context. So that gives us a pretty broad idea of who these readers were. Their general frame of reference is Deuteronomy 30. Now, could somebody turn to Deuteronomy 30, or a couple of you, because we're going to read this text. We're going to read the whole chapter. Now, I'm not suggesting that what we're going to read is exclusive to Deuteronomy 30, but Deuteronomy 30 represents, in a concise chapter, the framework of thinking of the audience at the time that John wrote this. And so it's extremely important that we understand this in order to understand what we're reading today. So would somebody read, or a couple of you read, Deuteronomy 30?
And it shall come to pass, when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations, whether the Lord thy God hath driven thee. And shall return unto the Lord thy God, and shall obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children with all thine heart and with all thy soul. Then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all nations, whether the Lord thy God hath scattered thee. If any of thine be driven out unto the outmost parts of heaven, from hence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from hence will he fetch thee. And the Lord thy God will bring thee into the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it, and he will do thee good, and multiply thee above thy fathers. I'll let somebody else take it from there.
Verse 6.
The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and with all your soul and will. The Lord your God will put all these curses on your enemies who persecute you. You will again obey the Lord and follow all his commands I've given you today. Then the Lord your God will make you the most prosperous in all the work of your hands, and the fruit of your womb, the young of your livestock, and the crops of your land. The Lord will again delight in you and make you prosperous, just as he delighted in your fathers, if you obey the Lord your God and keep his commands and decrees that are written in this book of the law, and turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. Let someone else pick it there.
For this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. It is not in heaven, that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us to get it for us, and make us hear it, that we may observe it? Nor is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who will cross the sea for us, to get it for us, and make us hear it, that we may observe it? But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, and death and adversity, and that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and keep his commandments, and his statutes, and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. But if your heart turns away, and you will not obey, but are drawn away, and worship other gods, and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You will not prolong your days in the land where you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess it.
Seventeen.
19.
I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob to give them.
Okay, good. Thank you guys for reading that. There are, in this verse, this chapter rather, there are two important distinctions. And the first is that we're talking about life and death. We're talking about blessing and cursing, and very polarized teaching out of Deuteronomy. And these people, this audience, would have been extremely familiar with this idea, because in synagogue, over the course of hundreds of years, this in the Torah, because it's part of the Torah, it would have been read on a consistent basis. I mean, this is very familiar and important to them, how they would view life. Life is living in relationship with God in the land, in community, in the now. Life is in the now, in their minds. That's extremely important. Whereas death is being out of harmony with God, scattered and separated from the land and in the now. Life and death. Now, in our Christian way of thinking, we kind of transpose that into heaven and hell. But in their minds, we've got to understand how they thought about it. It is in the now. Life is in harmony and in union. Choose life, the writer of Deuteronomy says. And then the idea of death is separateness, away from, out of the land, out of harmony with God. There is no king in death. So let me move on from there. So their governing perspective towards the end of the first century, here it is. This is how these people would be reading John's gospel. They're working from, first of all, they as a people are the people of God. For millennia, they have had this identity through Abraham, their father, that they were given divine promise that God will bless them and bless all the nations of the earth through them. And that they would have a land. They would be a people. And they would dwell in harmony together. That goes back to Abraham. As they trace the history, now at the end of the first century, they knew about how they struggled in Egypt, and they became a nation, and they came out, and they occupied the land, the promise right there, and that that in time they were given a king, King David. Although there's some side stuff on that, but they were given a king, and they were created a temple, a place of worship, and it was a powerful time. Israel as a nation became a powerful force, and they pinnacled out in this realm of promise that God had promised them. But then, just like, wow, slamming your thumb in the door, there was a brutal loss in 586 BCE when the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem, destroyed the city, destroying the temple, and deported all off to Babylon. Guys, this is the defining moment in Israel's history. This is when everything changed. The people of God being deported, and it was, we can't relate to this. The only way we could even possibly think about this is what we went through on one single day in 9/11, when we were invaded. And that in my lifetime changed the world for us, just one day. But in this case, they suffered. They lost everything, and they were deported. People being deported, families being broken up and taken off to a foreign land, scattered. Now, do you not think they thought of Deuteronomy 30? Being under the judgment of God. That would have been the wrath of God to them, experiencing that. So, pinnacle passed and then brutal lost. There was a return, 539 under Cyrus. They came back to the land, but it was never the same. And if you read Ezra and Nehemiah and Ezra, you see how they had the temple under Ezra, but yet the older ones that could remember what it was like were weeping because it was just not the same. There was a recovery, but there wasn't a recovery. And then from that point on, Israel as a nation were not a nation. They were governed under Persian, Babylonian, Persian, and then Greek, and now finally Roman rule. They were a people who were suppressed and always the underclass, and they were in a sense scattered as a people. They were not adhering and receiving the promise that God had given them back in a period under Abraham. And then to top it all off, there was even more loss, because in the early intertestamental period and then a little bit later, there were always these small Jewish revolts, and now Rome is dominant. And finally, they just got sick and tired of this Jewish uprisings in Israel, and they came in and wiped out the whole thing. Again, the second temple being destroyed in 70 AD, a reenactment of here. The Herodian temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It had been, and now, living at the end of the first century, there was a high degree of uncertainty. This Jesus had come, and they were, what do we do with this? We automatically think that, Jesus, his ministry and his resurrection would have changed the world. Well, it did eventually, but they were trying to deal with all this. News didn't travel like it does today, and there is a high degree of uncertainty with what do we do with all this. And that would have taken us up to where we are in the text. Now, all of this bracketed together, this governing perspective, these folks had a history of chronic pain. These people are in pain in the end of the first century. And we could call that a living under the punishment of God identity. Every time in synagogue they hear Deuteronomy 30. Well, obviously, we're out of relation with God. We're being punished. We're being cursed because we have not gained what has been promised to us. I mean, I don't know how they would have thought any different, but they are, in a sense, they have not yet experienced the promise of God. Did you have a question?
Well, I was just thinking, do you think they knew? I mean, I know from our perspective, looking at it, it's pretty clear, but I'm not so certain that the people of that time correlated their pain to their rejection of God directly.
Probably not. But they would have known that what God promised to Abraham is certainly not happening, and it is not happening. It has not happened in our whole for centuries. How long, God? How long? Yeah, Dick.
I would put forth in response to Mike, there's so many prophets, if you read the Old Testament, that told them what was going to happen to them.
Yeah.
I mean, time after time, and actually centuries after centuries, they were being told.
I'm not arguing that they couldn't know. I'm just not sure they, I should say, the information was definitely available,
Okay,
but the question is did they really perceive it?
okay.
Because like when you hear about the conversation from the Pharisees and stuff, it's pretty clear they still think, you know, we are the people of God, our way is God's way.
You're saying they didn't get it?
Yeah, they didn't get it.
Some things never change.
That's right.
Yeah, some things never change.
2,000 years later, it still hasn't changed.
I mean, that's where the amazing correlation is. Some things never change. Bill.
Well, there's a couple things. They were still also living under the timeline of Daniel. They were the high anticipation of the Messiah. And they had 2 or 3 of them. I remember reading it right, there was a guy named Barkov, I can't remember the name, but they thought they had a couple Messiahs there for a while. They had a following. They all got crucified and wiped out. So that was, taken care of. So they were anticipating a Messiah, which was supposed to, the presence of the Messiah was supposed to then take care of the problem. That was supposed to lead them to a solution.
And
So
that-
that was a big deal.
But and then Jesus as Messiah, the Christ, he didn't fit what they were expecting
No,
at all.
right.
They were thinking someone to unify the nation and bring them back in the line, and to set up a king,
It fits this problem.
and they would revert back to here.
Yep.
Yep.
Well, I'm gonna give credit to Art on this. He just said, what you're calling a jungle, we're now calling a swamp.
Okay, explain that a little bit more.
I'm just relaying what Art just told me.
So is the idea of swamp because we're stuck?
Think
Had to do with the leadership.
Washington DC.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we are swamped in a lot of ways. So, again, this would have been their governing perspective, at least from my perspective. And so I'm just humbly submitting that to you. So we'll start with the text, and we're going to work through section by section. And of course, again, my interpretation of this is now John the Baptist has stopped talking. His last statement is, he must increase, I must decrease. And now John the Apostle is wrapping up this first section of his gospel. And he begins this by saying, he who comes from above is above all. I've got above from above because it directly correlates. It's that Greek word anelton that John penned in the interaction between Jesus and Nicodemus, born from above. It's the same. So there's a direct flow here of what is happening in the text. He who comes from above is above all. This is what John the writer has been proving, saying in his entire first 3 chapters, that this one, Jesus, and who is the Christ. And notice the last testimony of John right prior to this is that he uses correlates Jesus with the Christ, this one who's to come, this one they were all looking for. And that's his, that's part of his final testimony. So what John the writer is saying is that this first statement is referencing the Christ, and I'm using the Christ and not Jesus specifically because Jesus is the Christ. And that is who he is, the one that everyone was looking for. Unfortunately, they just didn't get it. And then contrast to that, he who is of the earth is from the earth and speaks of the earth. I think he's now making a correlation or a contrast to John's ministry. John is not the Christ. Jesus is the Christ. And then finally, he who comes from heaven is above all. Above all, above all. Christ, John, Christ.
Why was he redundant there?
Because Well, let me,
Okay.
well, I don't know, but I'll give you my opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, expressing parallel thought is a very common way of expressing ideas, in especially like the book of Proverbs. You know, it's called Hebrew parallelism. You know, and so I'm going to try to make sense out of it here. John brings the first section of his gospel account to conclusion by using 3 parallel statements to extrapolate on John's parting words that just happened, John the Baptist's parting words. Notice how the first 3 chapters, in John's gospel, incrementally clarify who Jesus is, beginning in verses 1 through 4. And we've already looked at this in our study. There's a progression. John chapter 1, 1 through 4. He reinterprets Genesis chapter 1 with now a second power in heaven. This was a new idea, guys. They had no idea. I mean, there was a developing theology on Trinity that wouldn't actually be stated until the 4th century. But this is new. John, the writer, is saying, no, there's a second power in heaven. And that second power is the divine creative element that created and holds all things together, developed later by the Apostle Paul. So that's the beginning, that this word has always been there. The word becomes flesh in verse 14. And then later in the chapter, Jesus is introduced and he starts correlating Son of God term that has theological meaning. More importantly, Son of Man. And now the Christ. See, there's a progression of thought in the first 3 chapters of who this Jesus is. And now it's culminating with John's final testimony in 3:27 through 30, the Christ. To Christ. He's the one. He's the one we've been waiting for. John, the writer, now punctuates this progression of thought through the first 3 chapters through the use of the term, the one who is above all. The one who is above all. That's what he's correlating to the Christ, is the one who is above all. This distinction would have brought clarity of understanding to the first century readers. This is the one we're waiting for. Yes, go ahead.
I would just encourage, all is a little 3-letter word, but I'd encourage you, if you really want to have your understanding kind of expanded, speaking for myself and having done this, do a deep word study in the Bible of the word all. It's one of those words, we use it so commonly and all the rest of this. It's an amazing word in Scripture.
Yeah. Well, good, thank you.
It means far more than you
Yeah.
kind of think it does when
It
you
would.
read it.
Yeah, I got the feeling from what you're saying is if you do this, you'll be blessed.
Yep.
Yeah. So, verse 31, our first one, we're going to stop here because of time, and we're going to pick up, we'll do a short review next week. We've got the basis now out of Deuteronomy 30 in order to understand this text. We've cast what their frame of reference is, the way they're thinking, and then we'll pick up here next week and we'll work through the text incrementally to hopefully derive some meaning out of it for us today. So thanks for coming, and see you next week.
Bless the House.
Before you leave,